first of all, we can, and I'm going to give you in a few minutes some examples of where we have done that. So don't be so quick to accept the premise. Mearsheimer is a very smart man and has much to teach us, and especially in that field of international relations, where most of it is really poor journalism. That's about it. He brings a much more refreshing, serious, analytical mind to it all. Let me take an example from the United States. And we can see it by going back for a moment to settler colonialism. I remember taking my children when they were younger to a small town in western Massachusetts. The name of the town, Old Deerfield. And in the town of Old Deerfield, they've done something very interesting. They've reconstructed the way houses looked in the colonial time, the early time, before the United States was a country, before we were independent, when we were an early new colony of Great Britain, okay? And if you walk through the town, very interesting, the way the houses inside and outside, historians and archaeologists have reconstructed an old colonial village, a tourist attraction. So it's interesting, it's different, and I thought it might interest my children, which it did. But there was also something horrifying, because there are little signs in front, I believe, of each house. There's a little sign about what happened here in 1742, or whatever the year was. And the sign read like this: on the 18th of July, in the evening, the savages came and slaughtered 2 women and 4 children and a goat. The next house. Here, there was a hanging of savages that were caught stealing cows or horses. Next house. The savage, and I remember explaining to my children something that's very bizarre. The Europeans come 3,000 miles across the water from where they were born, from where they grew up in Europe, come 3,000 miles and enter the territory in which local people have been living for thousands of years, take their land, kill many of them, but they are the savages. Everything that happened in colonial New England was contextualized by the danger to the community posed by the evil other. Evil others have been part of American life from the beginning. You had to make savages of these people, because if you didn't make them savages, what would they be? And the answer is victims. Victims of, they didn't come to Europe. Europeans came to them. They didn't take the land from the Europeans. The Europeans took the land from them. The Israelis have this problem. The Palestinians didn't go to Europe. The European Jews mostly came to that part of the world. And they had more money and they had more connections, blah, blah, blah. And so you have a problem here. For the Jews, again, I just want to make the parallel. For the Jews in Israel, how are they going to look at the Palestinians? They could, the way the Palestinians do, they could say, look how poor their income is. Look how bad their diet is. Look how early in life they die. Look at how ill they are. Look at how poor their homes are. Then they become maybe victims. But who would they be victims of? Israeli Jews. So it's impossible. You can't live with this. So they become savages. They're the ones, you're not threatening them, they are threatening you. And everything you're doing is defense. Everything the Israeli army does is identified by the letters IDF, the Israeli Defense. They are defending. They went crazy after October 7th because Hamas attacked them. They actually were victimized, just a few of them, 1,200, terrible. But there was, for that moment, the real, and it touched a nerve in these people. They feel victimized, even if they weren't hurt when those Hamas people attacked on the 7th, even if they weren't there, even if their family wasn't there. They felt the anger and bitterness of the Palestinian population, now expressed by Hamas, and we must and we have the right to defend ourselves, and we will destroy those who want to destroy us. Hamas is a very good target for them because Hamas actually has a position of getting rid of Israel. Israel is one of the last, if not the last, effort at what we call settler colonialism. Settler colonialism. That's when a group of people, sometime in the last 4 centuries, the history of capitalism, a group of people settle in a colonial territory. So the British government or the Dutch government or somebody else takes over some land, usually with military force, and then to make it a paying proposition. And remember, the goal in colonial situations was to make the colony pay for its own colonization. So, for example, the first book I ever wrote was about British colonialism in East Africa. And they made the people of East Africa grow coffee, the single most important product, Arabica coffee, grown in the highlands in the middle of Kenya. Okay, they needed labor, so they made the Africans live in reserved areas where they could not sustain themselves. There wasn't enough land. There wasn't enough place for animals. So the only way to survive would go to be and work on the coffee farm of the colonial British who came in, got the land for next to nothing, and were now provided with the labor and could sell their coffee back into London. Okay, so that was a settler colonialism. Australia is another one. New Zealand is another one. South Africa is another one. Canada and the United States are also. What you notice, though, in the list I just gave you, is that the settlers found themselves sooner or later in a oppositional position with the local population. And so what began to happen was the systematic destruction of those local people. So, for example, again, using my example of Kenya, it eventually produced in the early 1950s something called the Mau Mau Rebellion of Black Africans rising up against the British. And it forced the British out. A few years after that, even though they slaughtered huge numbers of African people, by that time it was over. They knew, and the British had to leave. Here in the United States, same thing. Ethnic cleansing is what the settlers eventually did. They destroyed, literally by mass killing, the native or indigenous people. The few that remain are still to this day stuck, many of them, on reservations where they can barely make a living. Indigenous Americans are among the poorest, the least healthy, the most riddled with crime and alcohol and all the rest. It became, after they were done, it became a new world in which ethnic cleansing and the slaughter of indigenous people was no longer celebrated. In the 17th, 18th, 19th century, the British thought they were bringing God and civilization and progress and modernity to India or to Pakistan or to fill in the blank. But nowadays, everybody not everybody, but almost everybody understands that that's not what was going on, that there was money being made. It was a standard joke in England that if you could not be successful in your career in England, you could always go to the colonies, and there you would become a gentleman farmer, because all the work was done by the masses in India and so forth, okay? The problem for Israel is that it's trying to do the same thing, but it's doing it too late. The world is not what it was. The balance of forces is not what it was. You can't do in the 21st century what was common in the 18th and 19th centuries. Nobody should be surprised at that. But there's deep in the Israeli population a sense of the hypocrisy of the British or the Americans or the Australians wanting them to make a deal. Well, they didn't make a deal. There's no two-state solution for the Maori people in New Zealand or the Aboriginal people in Australia or the indigenous people in the United States and Canada. Not at all. No two-state solution. They couldn't even vote in elections here until a few years ago. So they don't have most civil rights, and on and on and on. So that's the first problem. Israel is caught in a historic impossibility. The world will not tolerate what the Israelis are doing. The very people who did it themselves 200 years ago are now not willing to watch it unfold here. Yes, for the first few months, they all looked away and pretended they didn't have to, but now, and you know why? Because the rest of the world, the Arab world, the Muslim world, and the whole world watching this slaughter is horrified. You can't be telling anybody that they're bringing God or modernity or anything else. You are slaughtering the people in order to take the land. That's what it's about. And the rest of the world protests. And that makes it very hard for the Western world, Australia, New Zealand, and the rest of them to pretend that they can be neutral. They can't. They can't. So that's the first problem. Israel's project is a historical impossibility. You cannot do it now. And wherever they draw the red line, whether it's going into the camp at Rafah, or whether it is, by the way, attacking a consulate in Damascus of the Iranian government without any provocation that anybody has been able to point to, just as an act of war in a non-war situation when you're already at war somewhere else. This is crazy stuff. And the world looks at it that way. And if they take the troops out of Gaza and put them against Hezbollah in the north and against Lebanon and so on, it'll be the same. You can't do this now. And the Israelis are discovering they can't. Mr. Biden has been pro-Israel all of his life. He collects huge amounts of money from pro-Israeli donors here in the United States. He has all his alliances built around that. And you could see what he did. He was 100% for Israel. Yeah, now he's 42% for Israel. Why? Has he changed his mind? Of course not. But he sees all around the world the signs of a changed situation. He miscalculates because he doesn't understand the big picture. You and I have discussed this. He miscalculated, and the people around him and the European leaders, they didn't understand what they were doing going to war against Russia. The war against Russia, they are losing that war. And there's no sign of changing. They have escalated over and over again. They would never send in tanks. They did. They would never send in surface-to-air missiles. They did. They would never send in F-15 fighter planes. They did. Now they will never send troops on the ground. They probably will. None of it works. None of it works. Here's another sign. The whole world is supporting mostly Hamas, not Israel. Therefore, they miscalculated. They thought they could destroy Hamas. They can't. Every time they kill somebody, and they call everybody they kill Hamas, every time they kill somebody, 3 more people become Hamas because they saw their mother being killed or they saw their child being destroyed. You are creating more Hamas with every day. This is crazy. This is a policy that is self-destructive, but you can't see it in the minds of many in Israel. They can't see it any more than the Americans could see that the Russians could and would mount a serious war effort, and not just serious militarily, but serious politically, serious diplomatically, serious, ideologically. They miscalculated. Those are the 2 major wars right now, Gaza and Ukraine, and the West miscalculated both of them. And no, those are not isolated incidents. They miscalculated in Iraq. They miscalculated in Afghanistan. The Taliban run Afghanistan. It's very clear. And the biggest winner in the Iraq-Iran situation is Iran, who's supposedly an enemy. I mean, and you're not seeing any adjustment. They can't see what is happening. So the biggest problem is a change in the world that these people have set themselves against. And if a relatively small group of people, Israeli Jews, are a small number, whatever it is, 6 million, 8 million, whatever the number is, but they're not strong enough to take on the whole world. And it's an illusion and a delusion for them to imagine that they can do that. They can't do it militarily. They can't do it economically. They can't do it politically. They can't even subdue the people of Gaza. The big picture of the United States is that the empire that it once had from 1945, let's say, to 1990, it's over. What collapsed in 1989 was not only the Soviet Union, but with it, the dominant position of the United States. That too began to collapse. The peak, when it was a unipolar hegemonic power, that peak was also the beginning of the decline. And until that is understood, which it is not, and accepted, which it is not, you will continue to have leaders that make unbelievable miscalculations because they're not seeing this big picture because it is so frightening. I repeat, Every empire the world has ever seen was born, evolved, and changed over time, and then it died. The American empire was born. We know where, when, and how. It has evolved over time. We know about that. So that we all know what the next step is. It's finished. The only question is not whether. It's only a question of when and exactly how. And what's going on is we're living through the early stages of that decline. And so what we see, and there's much understanding of this in the field of psychology, what we see is denial. The reaction, this is not, we are powerful, we are still, we are losing in Ukraine and we are losing in Gaza. And there's no amount of twisting and turning at this point that makes that untrue. Is the United States still powerful? Yes. Is it still very rich? Yes. Could it turn around these societies? Probably. But it can't do it to all of them. And there's now a fundamental new reality. There's more wealth gathered in the hands of the BRICS than is gathered in the hands of the G7. And this has to be an enormous change that is going to shape everything that happens, whether it be Ukraine or Gaza or any other corner of the world. The Russians have said, we are not going to lose this war. And the West has so far said, we're not going to lose this war. And they have both said they won't use nuclear weapons, or at least they won't be the first to use nuclear weapons. Well, if you're not going to use nuclear weapons, and neither side is going to let the other side win, then what are you saying? You're saying this is an endless war. You know, that's what I see. Israel is caught up in an endless war. But I'm afraid if I look at it all, the odds are the West will cave in because the cost of an endless war in the West is not worth it. Whereas the cost of that war for Russia is worth it. And in the end, I would therefore bet on Russia, but you never be sure. And the same is true in Israel. They can fight forever, but what kind of society is that? Look, I know from the United States, here's a statistic. More young men who serve in the American military die by suicide when they come back home than die in the war. The Israelis have been committing unspeakable behavior. That's going to affect Israel. Israel has a huge opposition inside the country that talks about what is going on and is against it. The Israelis are going to have to work that out, and that's going to be an incredibly difficult thing for them to do. That's why I know quite a few people in and out of Israel who say, and it's not just political rhetoric, but who say with real intensity that the greatest damage imaginable is being done to the Israelis. They're not suffering the bombs. I don't want to compare it. The suffering of the Palestinians is for sure the horror, the worst of this whole story, no question. But the Israelis are damaging their position, which is a minority position in a small corner of the world. You cannot survive if you have gone from the victim of a Holocaust to becoming the perpetrator of a Holocaust. And that's what's happening to the reputation of Israel around the world. And that is going to be an unbelievable burden for a country that already has lots of problems. Yeah, you can come to another solution. Whether the Chinese mean it or not, I don't know. I'm no expert on China, and I'm not pretending or have any interest in pretending that their motives aren't complicated and so forth. But I don't see them running around the world fighting wars. They're not provoking wars. The United States is provoking war in Taiwan. You could see Taiwan from China. You can't see it from the United States. What in the world is going on? Sending troops to Taiwan, sending military equipment. What are you doing? Again? Again? The United States must have believed in the days when Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon opened up China and brought them into the WTO, that they could control how China developed. They couldn't, because colonialism is over. It's not coming back. It's done. But they didn't understand it. So China, with a goal of developing quickly, made some experiments. They tried the Soviet system. Government owned and operated the enterprise. They tried let's call it the Scandinavian system. Lots of government regulation, but basically private enterprise, private capitalism. And all that the Chinese did with their experiments, very practical, is they came up with a hybrid, an economy that is half public, owned and operated by the Chinese government, and half private capitalist enterprises, some Chinese, some Japanese, American, European, 50-50. Nobody's done that before. Russia was overwhelmingly, Soviet Union was overwhelmingly government-owned and operated. Britain and England, overwhelmingly private. And then mixtures before. But the Chinese are the first really big company to really kind of 50-50 and control the whole thing by a powerful government run by an even more powerful Communist Party. Okay, there are problems with this. There are injustices that are wrapped up. One can make all kinds of criticism, and I believe in social criticism, and it doesn't stop at China's door. But that's no excuse not to see what China has done. It has taken the largest population on the earth and pulled them out of poverty in one generation. No one has ever done that before. It took centuries to do that in Western Europe, North America, and Japan. Now, we have much to learn from that. And the Chinese seem willing, from what they say, and so far from what they do, to demand the right to develop their economy, but to be willing to sit down and work it out, as Britain and the United States were able to do in the 19th and the first half of the 20th century. So I don't think we need to be, Mearsheimer's might makes right. It's not always this, conflict. And if you have more battleships and you have more troops, you win. Does that happen sometimes? Of course. Is it a necessity? No. Look, Europe suffered unbelievably in World Wars I and II. After World War I, they tried to develop a way to stop it, the League of Nations. That failed. After World War II, they tried again. It fell apart. We have another crash. Capitalism is an unstable system. I used to say to my students when I lectured, if you lived with a roommate as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago. You would have said, no, thank you. I don't want a system that every 4 to 7 years, on average, in every country, crashes. Look at the words we have: downturn, recession, depression, crisis, meltdown. I could bore you for hours with all the words because it's so constant. We've been trying for 300 years to get over that, and we haven't been able to do it. Lots of smart people working very hard to get us out of that instability. And what do I tell you? In the year 2000, we had the dot-com crash, remember? Then in the year 2008, we had the subprime mortgage crash. And then in 2020, we had the COVID-19 crash. And right now, we're going into, well, it hasn't got a name yet, but I'm sure those clever economists like me will come up with a name. The names change, but the phenomena constantly. And what it means, and this is my last point, it means that people who live in capitalism, whether they're aware of it or not, are constantly worried. But that's not irrational. That's correct. They understand, even if they can't put it into words, that this is a system that every 4 or 5 years throws large numbers of people out of work, closes lots of businesses that are producing perfectly useful things that we all need. This is crazy. We don't want this. Nobody wants it. We never can stop having it. That's a sign of a system whose time has come, has grown. We've had it for a while. Now it's time to say, bye-bye. We as a human race can do better. The slaves could do better than slavery. The serfs better than feudalism. And I'm convinced that we can do better than capitalism. We just have to understand and make the effort, and we will do it and look back on getting beyond capitalism the way we now look back on getting beyond slavery and feudalism. Capitalism is a particular way of organizing the production and distribution of the goods and services we all depend on: our food, our clothing, our shelter, our transportation, our education, you name it. And in the history of the human race that we're all part of, or at least most of us, it has taken different form. People have organized their economies differently. For example, once upon a time, and not so long ago, and even in a few places today, there were masters and slaves. That's how they did it. Some people were slaves, some people were masters. The slaves did all the work. The masters got everything the slave produced because they owned not only the product, but they owned the producer, the human being. Then we had feudalism. That's another different kind of system. No slaves, no masters, but lords and serfs. And the basic way it worked was the serf did the work, raised the animals, grew the crops, kept enough for himself and his family, and the rest gave to the lord, who therefore lived kind of high on the hog, which you'll notice if you look at castles and chateaus in Europe, which is what they use that extra output to construct. We're a different system. We don't have masters and slaves, and we don't have lords and serfs. We went through a lot of trouble, including the French and American revolutions, to get beyond that. Turns out a lot of people didn't want to be slaves. And a lot of people didn't want to be serfs. So we instituted a new system called capitalism. And instead of masters and slaves, and instead of lords and serfs, we have something called employers and employees. One of them sits on top and makes all the decisions. You don't need me to tell you who that is, you know. And the other one comes to work in the factory, the office, the store, and does what he, she, they are told. Sit there, work with this, do that, use this machine, and at the end of the day, go home, have a pizza, come back tomorrow, do it all again. Okay? We have a capitalist system of employers and employees. We thought we were going to get liberty, equality, freedom, democracy by putting slavery behind us and by putting feudalism behind us. And those hopes and those dreams were reasonable. But we made a mistake. What we didn't understand is employer-employee is different, but it shares something in common. And the thing it shares in common with slavery and feudalism is that a few people sit at the top and have the power and the wealth in their hands, and the rest of us don't. And that what we really want, and wanted all along, we may have called it freedom when we were slaves. We might have called it liberation when we were serfs. But what we really wanted was a system in which we really could be our own boss, not have one over us. And capitalism isn't that, because it's a system, as everyone watching this show knows, in which a few people are the boss and the rest of us are the ones who get bossed around. Our language shows it. We're aware of it. Absolutely. We're talking, a lot of the myths, and the book is full of these. It goes through it. A lot of the myths that grew up were understandable. They were efforts by people who did real well in capitalism, who liked it, did well for them. There's always people the master thought slavery was pretty good, and the Lord thought feudalism was pretty good. We shouldn't be surprised that the people who sit at the top, in most cases, find nice things about the system, and so they tell stories as if kind of that's available to everybody, even though it isn't. And I try to go through those. But one of them is, if you didn't have capitalism, well, then you couldn't start your own business. That's silly. In slavery, you could start your own slave plantation. People did it. In feudalism, you could start your own feudal manor, which is what they called it. And in capitalism, you can start your own business. But if you set up a socialist system in which people work together as a community producing goods and services, you would want to create the opportunities for people with new ideas or new ways of doing things to start a business, to grow a business, and all the rest. What you wouldn't do, and this is the craw that somehow sticks in people's mind when they hear about it. You wouldn't be able to build your business beyond a certain point by exploiting, by taking large numbers of people who can't share in all that business can do because they're your employees. You will have to come to some accommodation with them. They are human beings like you, and in the socialist image that I'm talking about, they have the right to participate in what you have created, just like you have the right, they have the right to participate in what you helped to create. It's a kind of a sense, let me put it this way. At the Christmas party, in every job I've ever had, the boss gets up, rickety, he's a little drunk, and stands on the table and tells everybody at the Christmas party, we had a good year, and I want to thank each and every one of you for the contribution you made to the successful year we had. And then he takes 90% of what those people's labor produced for himself and has a really good Christmas and New Year vacation. They don't. My argument is you got to mean it. You got to understand that everybody participates, and that has to be recognized in the distribution of wealth and recognized in the distribution of respect. You're not going to be respectful of your fellow human being if you have a ranking of employer-employee. That's what's got to go. And we've got to be courageous enough to try. The same people who used to think you have to have a king, you have to have somebody who sits at the top of the society, an emperor, a czar, or whatever you wanted to call him. And then, a few hundred years ago, we got rid of them. We said, no more kings, no more monarchy, none of that. Or if we do, it's a ceremonial something for tourists to visit, but we don't take it seriously. Well, guess what? The kings are still there, only they changed their name. Now they're called CEOs. They're the people who are little emperors who sit in that factory or in that office or in that store telling everybody what to do and trying to make everyone to believe you can't run a business without somebody at the top. Yeah, you can run a country without a king, and you can run a business without people at the top. You can all together make a community that produces the goods and services. That's exactly what I'm after. It's fine with me if the co-ops buy and sell from each other, so there's no problem. If you want to have a market system, how they connect to one another, fine. Just like we now have a market system where capitalist enterprises interact with one another, co-ops can do that too. But you're exactly right. It has to be a democratic one person, one vote decision of the people. And I can clearly show you, and you all know it without me telling you, that if the workers together decide these things, they would never move their jobs, their families, disorient their whole life in order to move to a country they don't speak the language, they don't know the history, the culture, all of that. So that's exactly what we're after. Now, politically, how to do it. I'm going to give you just a couple of examples because these are real. They're happening because I want to show people it's already underway. It's not just pie in the sky, some idea I have of something that might happen in some distant future. In 1985, so we're talking, 30 years ago or more, 40 years ago, in Italy, not particularly communist country, a law was passed. And the law passed, here's how it went. If you become unemployed in Italy, lose your job, you have a choice. Let's call it Plan A, Plan B. Plan A, you get a weekly check like you do on the unemployment line in this country. That's one option. They call it the dole over there, or the Italian word for dole. But you have a second choice, written into the law of Italy. If you get at least 9 other unemployed people like yourself, here's what the government offers you. We will give you your entire year or 2 of weekly checks in a lump sum. We'll give it to you right now, and we'll give it to each of the 9 plus other unemployed if you use it to start your own co-op business. The argument of the Italians was, if you're unemployed for a long period of time, it's very bad for your head. It makes you feel unworthy. It puts strains and stresses on your family life and everything else. We don't want that. That's not a successful way of dealing. You'd be much happier if you were able to continue to work. You might even be doubly happy if you were in charge of the business that was giving you a job. In other words, you gave yourself a job, but you don't have the money. We're going to give you money we would have given you anyway. No extra money out of the government's pocket. You can't qualify for unemployment for the next 2 or 3 years because you've gotten it basically in advance. And they have co-ops all over Italy. In one region, the Emilia-Romagna, some people may know that area around Bologna in Italy, 40% of their economy is worker co-ops. They've done it. They've been very successful for decades. Americans don't have to start from scratch. There are models all over the place. England has them. Germany has them. Here's an example that may blow your mind. The most successful worker co-op is actually in Spain, in the city of Mondragon, just below the Pyrenees Mountains that separate Spain from France. They have 100,000 people. They started in a Roman Catholic church in the city of Mondragon in 1956, a priest and 6 parishioners. They made a joke during the Sunday ceremonies. If we wait for somebody to come here and hire us, we'll be unemployed the rest of our lives. It was a poor part of Spain at that time. So the priest said, how about we become our own employer? We become a co-op. And he started, Father Arizmendi by name. That's what he did. Well, it's 100,000 people now. It's called the Mondragon Corporation. It's been around for more than half a century. It is the most successful worker co-op. And by the way, if I had a lot of time, which I know we don't, I could tell you about the co-op. Worker co-ops have their problems, it's not heaven, it's not, the final solution, none of that. But it's a better way of going about it, and we have plenty of models. The one in Spain is so successful that they have their own university, the Mondragon University, where I've been there. You can go there. They have courses, how to start a worker co-op, how to finance a worker co-op, how to solve the human problems as people go from